When we think of Paris today, our minds drift to a specific set of images. We see the sparkling lights of the Eiffel Tower. We imagine the wide, tree-lined avenues of the Champs-Élysées. We smell fresh bread, expensive perfume, and rain on pavement. It is the capital of romance, fashion, and culture. But if you were to step into a time machine and set the dial back 700 years, to the year 1300, you would not be greeted by the city of lights. You would be greeted by the city of night, and more aggressively, you would be greeted by the city of smells. Welcome to the reign of King Philip the Fair. At the turn of the 14th century, Paris was effectively the center of the Western world. It was a marvel of Gothic architecture, home to the University of Paris and the jewel in the crown of France. But beneath the soaring spires of the Notre Dame Cathedral, the reality on the ground was a nightmare of congestion and filth. Imagine a city with a population of over 200,000 people, the largest in Europe, crammed into a space a fraction of the size of modern Paris. Now imagine this city has no indoor plumbing, no garbage trucks, no sewer system, and no zoning laws. In the year 1300, Paris was not just a city, it was a biological hazard. It was a labyrinth of twisting, unpaved streets where the daily struggle wasn't just finding food or money, but simply crossing the road without ruining your clothes or catching a fatal infection. In this documentary, we are going to strip away the romanticized paintings of knights and damsels. We are going down to street level. We are going to wade through the mud, dodge the waste falling from the windows, and explore the gritty, visceral reality of daily existence. This is the story of how Parisians lived, worked, and survived in what was, essentially, the world's largest open-air sewer.
This mud is treacherous, sir.
To understand the stench, you first have to understand the layout. Medieval Paris was a fortress of congestion. Unlike the Paris of today, which was redesigned in the 19th century with wide boulevards, the Paris of 1300 was a tangle of narrow, chaotic alleyways. Some streets were no wider than a single cart. The houses were built of timber and plaster, rising 4 or 5 stories high. But as they went up, they jutted out. This architectural feature, known as jetties, meant that the second floor stuck out further than the first, and the third further than the second. In the narrowest alleys, the roofs of opposing houses would almost touch, effectively blocking out the sky. This created a perpetual twilight on the street below. The sun rarely hit the ground. And because the sun couldn't reach the ground never dried. Parisians had a name for the substance that coated their city. They called it la boue, the mud. But this wasn't just dirt and rain. It was a thick, black, sticky paste. It was a mixture of decaying garbage, animal entrails, rotting straw, and of course, human excrement. This sludge was so notorious that it became a defining characteristic of the city. It stained everything. If you walked in Paris, you brought the smell of Paris home with you on your hemline. The streets themselves were designed to be primitive drains. They were built with a slope toward the center, creating a central trench or gutter. In theory, rain was supposed to wash the filth down this central channel and into the river. In practice, the streets were often clogged with debris, causing the toxic soup to stagnate. During the rainy seasons, these central gutters would overflow. The ground floors of shops and homes were frequently flooded with this mixture. It was a world where you didn't just walk, you navigated. Wealthy Parisians would never dream of walking through the worst of it. They rode horses or they hired porters, strong men whose job was to carry people on their backs across the street, like human fairies. just to keep their shoes dry. So where did all this filth come from? The answer lies in the domestic habits of the medieval citizen. In 1300, there was a simple, unwritten rule for waste management: tout à la rue, everything to the street. Inside the crowded tenement buildings, there were no toilets. While some castles and very wealthy abbeys had latrines that emptied into deep cesspits, the vast majority of the 200,000 citizens relied on the chamber pot. Every morning and throughout the day, these pots had to be emptied. The method was gravity. You simply opened your window and dumped the contents onto the street below. There was, technically, a law regarding this. You were required to shout a warning 3 times before tipping your bucket. The phrase was "Gaia Elo," watch out for the water. This phrase eventually mutated into the English word loo, a slang term for the toilet. But in a noisy, bustling city filled with iron-wheeled carts, shouting merchants, and ringing church bells, these warnings were often missed. Walking close to the walls of buildings was a game of Russian roulette. You were constantly at risk of being drenched from above. However, humans weren't the only ones contributing to the mess. Paris was a farm as much as it was a city. It was teeming with animals. Chickens pecked at the ground in alleyways. Geese waddled through the markets. But the true kings of the medieval street were the pigs. Pigs were the medieval garbage disposal system. They were allowed to roam free, eating the trash and feces that littered the ground. While they helped reduce the volume of garbage, they created new problems. They were large, aggressive, and dirty. They tripped horses and occasionally attacked small children. In fact, a royal decree had to be issued after a pig caused a horse to throw the king's son, leading to his death. The decree stated that no pigs were allowed on the streets, except for the pigs belonging to the monks of Saint Anthony, which were considered holy and allowed to roam with bells around their necks. So picture the scene. You are walking down a dark, narrow alley. Above you, waste is falling from windows. Below you, you are wading through black sludge. And ahead of you, a holy pig is eating garbage. This was the daily commute in 1300. All of this sludge had to go somewhere. Gravity did its work, pulling the liquid waste down the slopes of the city and into the river Seine. The relationship between Parisians and the Seine in 1300 is a horrifying paradox to the modern mind. The river was the city's lifeline. It was the primary highway for commerce, bringing in grain, wine, and wood. But it was also the primary source of drinking water. Every day, the Guild of Water Carriers, thousands of men with buckets on yokes, would dip their pails into the river to sell water to households. At the exact same time, the river was the city's main sewer. The famous bridges of Paris, like the Grand Pont and the Petit Pont, were not just roadways. They were covered in houses, lined with shops and homes on both sides. These bridge houses had no cesspits. Instead, they had simple chutes or holes in the floor that dropped waste directly into the river below. If you were a water carrier dipping your bucket downstream from a bridge, you were likely collecting water that had been contaminated mere seconds before. Furthermore, the banks of the Seine were lined with industry. This brings us to the butchers and the tanners. The district of the Grand Boucherie, the Great Butchery, was a powerhouse of pollution. Animals were slaughtered in the heart of the city. In the absence of strict regulation, the blood, entrails, and organs that couldn't be sold were washed into the gutters, flowing in crimson streams directly into the Seine. Nearby, the tanners were hard at work, turning animal hides into leather. This process was chemically intensive and incredibly foul. Tanning required soaking hides in mixtures of urine, lime, and dog feces. These vats would often spill or be dumped into the river. The result was a river that was thick, murky, and lethal. Yet, without knowledge of bacteria or germ theory, the people drank it, cooked with it, and washed their clothes in it. The assault on the senses wasn't limited to waste and industry. In Paris of 1300, the smell of death was a constant neighbor. Hygiene and urban planning were non-existent, and the city's cemeteries were bursting at the seams. The most famous of these was the Cemetery of the Innocents. It was located right in the center of the city, near the bustling Les Halles market. For centuries, bodies had been buried there in mass grave. By 1300, the ground was so saturated with corpses that the soil level had risen 6 feet above the surrounding streets. The pressure of the decomposing earth was so great that it sometimes caused the cellar walls of neighboring houses to collapse, spilling bones and rotting flesh into people's basements. The smell radiating from the Cemetery of the Innocents was said to be so powerful that it could sour milk and cause people to faint. Just outside the city walls stood another horror, the Montfaucon gibbet. This was a massive stone structure, a multi-tiered gallows where the bodies of criminals were hanged and left to rot as a warning to others. At any given time, dozens of bodies would be swaying in the wind, slowly disintegrating, picked at by crows and rats. The wind would carry this scent back into the city, mixing with the smells of the tanneries and the streets. People in the Middle Ages were terrified of these smells, but not for the reasons we are. They didn't know about germs. They believed in miasma. Medical theory at the time stated that disease was caused by bad air. If you could smell something foul, you were inhaling sickness. To combat this, the wealthy carried pomanders, balls of ambergris, musk, herbs, and spices encased in metal filigree. They held these to their noses constantly as they walked through the streets, trying to create a personal bubble of safety. The king and the nobility simply fled. During the hot summer months, when the heat caused the street sludge to ferment and bubble, the stench became unbearable. The royal court would often leave Paris entirely, moving to castles in the cleaner countryside, leaving the commoners to stew in the heat and filth. You might be asking, did no one try to fix this? Was there no government? There were attempts. A century earlier, King Philip Augustus had famously fainted from the smell of the mud while pacing near an open window in his palace. In a rage, he ordered the main thoroughfares of Paris to be paved with stone. By 1300, under Philip the Fair, this work continued, but it was slow and expensive. There were laws on the books. Fines were issued for not cleaning the street in front of your house. There were designated muckrakers, men with carts whose job was to scoop up the filth and transport it outside the city walls to dumps. But the city was growing too fast. The muckrakers were overwhelmed. As soon as a street was cleared, it was filled again within hours. The dumps outside the city walls grew into massive, fuming hills that surrounded Paris like a siege army of garbage. The sheer density of the population made cleanliness impossible. With 200,000 people living in such close quarters, producing waste every single day, the infrastructure simply didn't exist to handle it. Parisians developed coping mechanisms. They wore pattens, wooden overshoes with raised platforms strapped over their leather boots to elevate their feet a few inches above the mud. They used heavy perfumes. They burned rosemary and lavender in their homes to purify the air. But ultimately, they just adapted. They became nose-blind. The stench became the background radiation of their lives. Living in this environment took a heavy toll. Infection was rampant. A small cut on your leg from a splash of street mud could lead to gangrene and death within days. Infant mortality was sky-high, and unknowingly, this environment was setting the stage for the greatest catastrophe in human history. The rats, thriving in the garbage-filled streets and cellars of 1300, were multiplying. They were the perfect vessels. Just a few decades later, in 1348, the Black Death would arrive in Paris. The conditions we have described, the filth, the congestion, the waste, would act as fuel for the plague, wiping out nearly half the population. It would take centuries for Paris to clean itself up. It wasn't until the 19th century, over 500 years later, that the modern sewer system was built, finally separating the city from its waste. So, the next time you see a picture of medieval Paris, or watch a movie with clean, well-groomed peasants walking through a quaint stone village, remember the reality, remember the smell, remember the mud, and be thankful for modern plumbing. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker side of history, and if you're glad you weren't born in the mud of 1300, hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more gritty, realistic stories like this. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. We are going to uncover more forgotten, dirty, and dangerous moments from the past.